pleased to welcome you all to the new edition of the International Game of Studies on the Origins of Contemporary Philosophy, held at the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo. This year, the conference follows a hybrid format, mixing online and on-site contributions. The daily schedule for the 5 days of conference will be as follows. First, a morning lecture held by a keynote speaker, followed by a discussion session in which a Brazilian guest professor will comment on the lecture. Then, in the afternoon, international and national professors, all of them are closely interlinked with the personnel and research program of our study group, will take the floor for 2 more lectures. Finally, in the evening, there will be a graduate students and postdoc presentations session. The keynote speakers of this year are Professor Robert Brandom, Pittsburgh University, Professor Peter Simons, Trinity College, Dublin, Professor Mark Textor, King's College, London, Professor Thomas Ubel, Manchester University, and Professor Lydia Payton, Virginia Tech University. The debaters are respectively Gabriel Ferreira, Unicinos, André Leclerc, Universidade de Brasília, Ernesto Giusti, Unicentro, Marco Silva, Universidade Federal do Ceará, and Lucas Bacará. Afternoon talks are to be given by Professor Ingolf Max, Universität Leipzig, Professor Hernan Princh, Universidade Diego Portales, Chile, Professor André Leclerc, Universidade de Brasília, Professor André Porto, Universidade Federal de Goiânia, Professor Marco Silva, Universidade Federal do Ceará, Professor Ernesto Giusti, Unicentro, Professor Gabriel Ferreira, Unicinos, and I, in São Paulo. Finally, it is an honor to announce that the 2 days opening lecture is going to be held by the highly esteemed Professor Robert Brandom. Professor Brandom is widely recognized by his contributions on the philosophy of language and history of philosophy. An exhaustive list of Professor Brandom's academic titles and achievements is far too long to be enunciated. Therefore, I shall only highlight the fact that he is broadly taken as one of the most influential philosophers in the world today. His opening lecture will be followed by a discussion session with Professor Gabriel Ferreira. I would like to thank both of them for accepting to take part in our meeting. Without further ado, Professor Brandom, you may take the floor.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be able to address this group.
Bob, let me just introduce you, just say just a few words before giving you the floor. So, as Mario mentioned, Professor Robert Brandom is a distinguished professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and he is a fellow of British Academy, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and is the author of many papers and books, from which I would stress his Making It Explicit, The Tales of the Mighty Dead, but also his newest one, The Spirit of Trust, reading of Hegel's Phenomenology. And before we get started, I would like, just on the personal side, to thank you, Bob. I had the marvelous opportunity to spend a few months in Pittsburgh in a short research stay funded by Fulbright with Professor Brandom. And despite being one of the brightest minds we have out there, Professor Brandom was always one of the biggest examples of kindness and intellectual friendship I've ever seen. So thank you so very much, Brandom, for that and for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Gabrielle. It was a pleasure then, and it's a pleasure now. I want to talk about the Pragmatist Enlightenment. Classical American pragmatism can be viewed as a minor parochial philosophical movement that was theoretically derivative and politically inconsequential. From this point of view, roughly that of Russell and Heidegger, mandarins who spoke for quite different philosophical cultures, it's an American echo in the last part of the 19th century of the British utilitarianism of the first part. What's echoed is a crass shopkeeper's sensibility that sees everything through the reductive lenses of comparative profit and loss. Bentham and Mill had sought a secular basis for moral, political, and social theory in the bluff bourgeois bookkeeping habits of the competitive egoist, for whom the form of a reason for action is an answer to the question, what's in it for me? James and Dewey then show up as adopting this conception of practical reason and extending it to the theoretical sphere of epistemology, semantics, and the philosophy of mind. Rationality in general then appears as instrumental intelligence, a generalized capacity for getting what one wants. From this point of view, the truth is what works. Knowledge is a species of the useful, and the mind and language are tools. The instinctive materialism and anti-intellectualism of uncultivated common sense is given a refined expression in the form of a philosophical theory. Now, the utilitarian project of founding morality on instrumental reason is notoriously subject to serious objections, both in principle and in practice. But it is rightfully seen as the progenitor of contemporary rational choice theory, which required only the development of the powerful mathematical tools of modern decision theory and game theory to emerge, for better or worse, as a dominant conceptual framework in the social sciences. And nothing comparable can be said about the subsequent influence of the pragmatists' extension of instrumentalism to the theoretical realm. In American philosophy, the heyday of Dewey quickly gave way to the heyday of Carnap. And the analytic philosophy to which Carnap's logical empiricism gave birth supplanted and largely swept away its predecessor. Although pragmatism has some prominent contemporary heirs and advocates, most notably, perhaps in the recent generation, Richard Rorty and Hilary Putnam, there are not many contemporary American philosophers working on the central topics of truth, meaning, and knowledge who would cite pragmatism as a central influence on their thinking, though I would, and I do. But classical American pragmatism can also be seen differently, as a movement of world historical significance, as the announcement, commencement, and first formulation of the fighting faith of a second Enlightenment. For the pragmatists, like their Enlightenment predecessors, reason is the sovereign force in human life. And for these later philosophers, as for the earlier, reason in that capacity is to be understood on the model provided by the forms of understanding distinctive of the natural sciences. But the sciences of the late 19th century, from which the pragmatists took their cue, were very different from those that animated the first Enlightenment. The philosophical picture that emerged of the rational creatures who pursue and develop that sort of understanding of their surroundings was accordingly also different. Understanding and explanation are coordinate concepts. Explanation is a kind of saying, making claims that render something intelligible. It's a way of engendering understanding by essentially discursive means. There are, of course, different literary approaches to the problem of achieving this end, different strategies for doing so. But there are also different operative conceptions of what counts as doing it, that is, of what one needs to do to have done it. And it's a change of the latter sort, bringing in its train, of course, a change of the former sort, that the pragmatists pursue. For the original Enlightenment, explaining a phenomenon, an occurrence, a state of affairs, a process, is showing why what actually happened had to happen that way. Why what is actual is, at least conditionally, necessary. By contrast, for what I'll call the new pragmatist Enlightenment, it's possible to explain what remains and is acknowledged as contingent. Understanding whose paradigm is Newton's physics consists of universal, necessary, eternal principles expressed in the abstract, impersonal language of pure mathematics. Understanding whose paradigm is Darwin's biology is a concrete, situated narrative of local, contingent, mutable, practical reciprocal accommodations of particular creatures and habitats. Again, the 19th century was the statistical century, which saw the advent of new forms of explanation in natural and the newly arrived social sciences. In place of deducing what happens from exceptionalist laws, it puts a form of intelligibility that consists in showing what made the events probable. Accounts in terms both of natural selection and of statistical likelihood show how observed order can arise contingently but explicably out of chaos, as the cumulative diachronic and synchronic result, respectively, of individually random occurrences. The mathematical laws articulating the basic order of the universe were, for enlightened thinkers of the 17th and 18th century, the ultimate given, the foundational, unexplainable explainers. Structural features of things so basic that this explanatory residue might even, as it did for the transitionally post-religious deists, require and so justify a final, minimal, carefully circumscribed, nostalgic appeal to the creator. Charles Sanders Peirce, the founding genius of American pragmatism, elaborated from the new selectional and statistical forms of scientific theory a philosophical vision that sees even the laws of physics as contingently emerging by selectional processes from primordial indeterminateness. Those laws, he thinks, are adaptational habits, each of which is in a statistical sense relatively stable and robust in the environment provided by the rest. The old forms of scientific explanation then appear as a special limiting case of the new. The now restricted validity of appeal to laws and universal principles is explicable against the wider background provided by the new scientific paradigms of how regularity can arise out of and be sustained by variability. The calm realm of laws of the First Enlightenment becomes for the second a dynamic population of habits, winnowed from a larger one, which has so far escaped extinction by maintaining a more or less fragile collective self-reproductive equilibrium. It's not just that we cannot be sure we've gotten the principles right. For on this view, the correct principles and laws may themselves change. The pragmatists endorse a radical kind of ontological fallibilism or mutabilism. Since the laws emerge only statistically, they may change. No Darwinian adaptation is final, for the environment it's adapting to may change, indeed must eventually change in response to other emerging Darwinian adaptations. And the relatively settled, fixed properties of things, their habits, as Peirce and Dewey would say, are themselves to be understood as such adaptations. The pragmatists were naturalists, but they saw themselves confronting a new sort of nature, a nature that's fluid, stochastic, with regularities being the statistical product of many particular contingent interactions between things and their ever-changing environments, hence emergent and potentially evanescent, floating statistically on a sea of chaos. The science to which this later Enlightenment looked for its inspiration had changed since that of the earlier in more than just the conceptual resources that it offered to its philosophical interpreters and admirers. In the 17th and 18th century, the impact of science was still largely a matter of its theories. Its devotees dreamed of, predicted, and planned for great social and political transformations that they saw the insights of the new science as prefiguring and preparing. But during this period, the new ways of thinking were largely devoid of practical consequences. They were manifestations rather than motors of the rising tide of modernity. By the middle of the 19th century, though, technology, the practical arm of science, had changed the world radically and irrevocably through the Industrial Revolution. From the vantage point of established industrial capitalism, science appeared as the most spectacularly successful social institution of the previous 200 years because it had become not only a practice, but a business. Its practical successes paraded as the warrant of its claims to theoretical insight. Technology came to embody understanding. The more general philosophical lessons the pragmatists drew from science for an understanding of the nature of reason and its central role in human life accordingly sought to comprehend intellectual understanding as an aspect of effective agency. To situate knowing that, some claim is true, in the larger field of knowing how to do something. The sort of explicit reason that can be codified in principles appears as just one, often dispensable expression of the sort of implicit intelligence that can be exhibited in skillful, because experienced, practice. Flexible, adaptable habit that's emerged in a particular environment by selection via a learning process. Like their Enlightenment ancestors, the pragmatists were not only resolutely naturalist in their ontology, but also broadly empiricists in their epistemology. For both groups, in Seller's phrase, science is the measure of all things, of those that they are, and of those that are not, that they are not. And for both groups, science is not just one sort, but the very form of knowing. What it knows not is not knowledge. But in place of the atomistic sensationalist empiricism of the older scientism, which was later rescued and resuscitated by the application of powerful modern mathematical and logical techniques to yield 20th century logical empiricism, in place of that, the pragmatists substituted a more holistic, less reductive, a more practical empiricism. Both varieties give pride of place to experience in explaining the content and rationality of knowledge and agency. But their understandings of that concept of experience are very different, corresponding to the different characters of the science of their times. The older empiricism thought of the unit of experience as self-contained, self-intimating episodes, events that constitute knowings just in virtue of their brute occurrence. These primordial acts of awareness are taken to be available to provide the raw materials that make any sort of learning possible, paradigmatically, by association and abstraction. By contrast to this notion of experience as Erlebnis, the pragmatists, having learned the lesson from Hegel, conceive experience rather as Erfahrung. For them, the unit of experience is a test-operate, test-exit cycle of perception, action, and further perception of the results of the action. On this model, experience is not an input to the process of learning. Experience is the process of learning. It's the statistical emergence by selection of behavioral variants that survive and become habits insofar as they are, in company with their fellows, adaptive in the environments in which they are successively and successfully exercised. This is the sense of experience, as Dewey says, in which a job ad can specify 3 years of experience necessary. They're not trying to rule out zombies. The rationality of science is best epitomized for the pragmatists, not in the occasion of the theorist's sudden intellectual glimpse of some aspect of the true structure of reality, but in the process by which the skilled practitioner coaxes usable observations by experimental intervention, crafts theories by inferential postulation and extrapolation, and dynamically works out a more or less stable but always evolving accommodation between the provisional results of those two enterprises, the experimental and the theoretical. The distinctive pragmatist shift in imagery for the mind is not from the mirror to the lamp, as it was from the First Enlightenment to Romanticism, but rather from telescope and microscope to the flywheel governor. These new forms of naturalism and empiricism, updated so as to be responsive to the changed character and circumstances of 19th century science, meshed with each other far better than their predecessors had. Early modern philosophers of the First Enlightenment notoriously had trouble fitting human knowledge and agency into its mechanist materialist version of the natural world. A Cartesian chasm opened up between the activity of the theorist, whose understanding consists in the manipulation of algebraic symbolic representings, on the one hand, and what is thereby understood on the other, the extended geometrical world represented by those symbols. Understanding, discovering, and acting on principles exhibited for these philosophers one sort of intelligibility, while matter moving according to eternal, ineluctable laws exhibited quite a different one. But on the pragmatist understanding, knower and known are alike explicable by appeal to the same general mechanisms that bring order out of chaos, settled habit out of random variation, namely the statistical selective structure that's shared by processes of evolution and processes of learning. That structure, for the pragmatist, ties together all the members of a great continuum of being, stretching from the processes by which physical regularities emerge, through those by which the organic evolves locally and temporarily stable forms, through the learning processes by which the animate acquire locally and temporarily adaptive habits, to the intelligence of the untutored common sense of ordinary language users, and ultimately to the methodology of the scientific theorist, which for the pragmatist is just the explicit, systematic refinement of the implicit, unsystematic, but nonetheless intelligent procedures characteristic of everyday practical life. For the first time, the rational practices embodying the paradigmatic sorts of reason exercised by scientists, understanding natural processes, become visible as continuous with and intelligible in just the same terms as the physical processes paradigmatic of what they understand. This unified vision stands at the center of the pragmatist's second enlightenment. A number of these master ideas of classical American pragmatism evidently echo themes introduced and pursued by earlier Romantic critics of the First Enlightenment. Pragmatism and Romanticism both reject spectator theories of knowledge, according to which the mind knows best when it interferes least and is most passive, merely reflecting the real. Knowledge is seen as an aspect of agency, a kind of doing. Making, not finding, is understood to be the genus of human involvement with the world. The Romantics and the Pragmatists share a suspicion of laws, formulae, principles, and deduction. They think abstract principle is hollow unless rooted in and expressive of concrete practice, and the reality is revealed in the first instance by lived experience in the life world. Scientific practice and the theories it produces cannot be understood apart from their relation to their origin in the skillful attunements of everyday life. Pragmatists and Romantics accordingly agree in rejecting universality as the hallmark of understanding. Essential features of our basic, local, temporary, contextualized cognitive engagements with things are leached out in their occasional universalized products. Both the Romantics and the Pragmatists see necessity as exceptional and is intelligible only against the background of the massive contingency of human life. Both groups emphasize biology over physics and see in the concept of the organic conceptual resources to heal the dualistic wound inflicted by the heedless use of an oversharp distinction between mind and world. Where the European Enlightenment had seen the natural light of reason as universal in the sense of shared or common, so that what one disinterested, selfless scientist could add as a brick to the edifice of knowledge, another could in principle do as well, the pragmatists, looking at the division of labor in what had become a modern industrial economy, saw the enterprise of reason as social in a more genuine, articulated, ecological sense, in which the contributions of individuals are not interchangeable or fungible, but each has a potentially unique contribution to make to the common enterprise, which requires many different sorts of skills, responses, ideas, and assessments, which all collectively serve as the environment in which each adapts and evolves. Here, too, the pragmatists made some common cause with romantics on some general issues, while offering their own distinctive blend of rationalism, naturalism, and Darwinian statistical scientism as a way of filling in those approaches. Nonetheless, pragmatism is not a kind of romanticism. Though the two movements of thought share an antipathy to Enlightenment intellectualism, pragmatism does not, like romanticism, recoil into the rejection of reason, into the privileging of feeling over thought, intuition over experience, or of art over science. Pragmatism offers a conception of reason that's practical rather than intellectual, expressed in intelligent doings rather than abstract sayings. Flexibility and adaptability are its hallmarks, rather than mastery of unchanging universal principles. It's the reason of Odysseus rather than the reason of Plato. But still, both are thought of as part of the natural world, in the sense in which natural science is acknowledged to have final authority over claims about nature. The pragmatists are also materialists, though theirs is a Darwinian rather than a Newtonian materialism. Evolutionary natural history aside, the biology that inspires the pragmatists is the result of the shift of attention, largely affected in Germany in the first half of the 19th century, from anatomy to physiology, from studying structure to studying function. The climate of German Romanticism may have provided an encouraging environment for this development, but the vitalistic biology that provided their organic metaphors was only a by then embarrassing pre-scientific precursor of the recognizably modern sort of biology pursued in the German laboratories in which William James trained. In fact, Romanticism had almost no direct influence on American pragmatism. Another point of contrast with various forms of 19th century materialism in Europe. There was an indirect influence through Hegel's idealism, which was particularly important for Peirce and Dewey, but Hegel's rationalism mattered as much for them as his romanticism. The transcendentalism of Emerson is another conduit for idiosyncratically filtered and transfigured romantic ideas. It was pervasive, though perhaps not dominant, in the Boston milieu in which Charles Peirce, William James, and Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was a pragmatist even though he disavowed the label because he associated it with James' sentimental attempt to find a place for religion in the modern worldview, all those thinkers were first acculturated in the Boston environment, and it clearly affected their thought in complex ways. But the pragmatists thought of themselves as continuing the Enlightenment philosophical tradition of Descartes, Locke, Hume, and Kant, all of whom thought that being a philosopher meant being a philosopher of science, understanding above all what the new science had to teach us, not only about the world, but about us knowers of it and agents in it. For the pragmatists, the advances of 19th century science were to provide the corrective needed to remedy the conceptual pathologies to which the giants of the Enlightenment had fallen prey. Those scientific advances, properly understood, would make it possible to reconcile pragmatism's central rationalist and materialist impulses in an irenic empiricist naturalism. Although pursuing some elements of the anti-Enlightenment agenda of romanticism by quite other means, the pragmatists always thought of themselves as offering friendly amendments in support of the basic philosophical mission of Enlightenment, of rethinking inherited ideas of rationality, understanding, agency, and self in light of the very best contemporary scientific understanding of the natural world. Pragmatism was a distinctively American movement of thought, in ways far more important than its immunity to romantic impulses, however. We've been taught just how much it owes to the peculiarity of its native cultural and historical soil in the United States by a magnificent book, Louis Menand's The Metaphysical Club, A Story of Ideas in America. The pragmatists themselves tended to situate and motivate their views by reference to the specifically philosophical tradition. They were, after all, with the exception of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a judge, at least at some point in their careers, professional philosophers. Well, in Peirce's case, a chronically unemployed professional philosopher, a situation we're only too familiar with today, but the point remains. Unemployed professional philosophers are still professional philosophers. Their interpreters, also professional philosophers, have generally followed them in this practice of looking back to their philosophical antecedents. Menand's great achievement, I think, is to widen the cultural focus and increase the depth of field of the scene in which they show up for us. The context Menand provides extends far beyond the sort of philosophical and scientific considerations that I sketched by way of introduction so far. He shows just how much more there is to the history of ideas than just the intellectual history and the history of philosophy. The rise of mass democracy, the ascendancy of industrial capitalism, the institutional professionalization of university education and high culture more generally, and the decentralization and shift of the cultural center of gravity of the United States away from its original seat in Boston are all shown to shape the development of pragmatism so as to stamp it indelibly as a specifically North American phenomenon. Menand deftly portrays the relations between these grand historical forces and the particularities, peculiarities, and personalities of the idea-empowered pragmatists who are its heroes. A principal limb of his argument concerns the significance of the experience of the American Civil War on the birth and growth of pragmatism. Northern politics before the war was driven by the disagreement between abolitionists and unionists. Abolitionists saw slavery in terms of absolute moral principles. Slavery was evil, and so the country had to pay whatever price was required to eliminate it, including, if necessary, splitting the South off so as to keep the Union pure of that evil. The Unionists, by contrast, acknowledged slavery as an evil, but urged that means be found to eliminate it more gradually, over a period of decades, so as to acknowledge the economic and cultural interests of white Southerners and keep the Union whole. The South's secession rendered the Unionists' arguments moot by uniting both parties as patriots of the Union. The attack on Fort Sumter made unavoidable a war that the bulk of abolitionists, no less than the Unionists, had neither anticipated nor desired. The horrific violence that ensued changed forever the thinking of the young generation of Harvard men who went off idealistically to fight. Holmes, who had been a staunch abolitionist, was severely wounded more than once. William James was not a combatant, but two of his younger brothers were, and one was seriously wounded. Peirce, like the others, had friends and classmates maimed and killed. They saw the Civil War as, above all, a colossal failure of American democracy. The democratic institutions on which we pride ourselves had proven themselves incapable of dealing with the high-stakes moral and economic issue of slavery. Politically unresolvable disputes degenerated into military conflict. Holmes, closest to the fighting, was also the most explicit about the lessons he drew from his experience and about their effect on the lifelong course of his thought. As Menand puts it, quote, "The lesson Holmes took home from the war can be put in a sentence. It is that certitude leads to violence." End of the quote. But Menand also makes a persuasive case that roughly the same dynamic moved the other founder members of the Metaphysical Club to draw the same general conclusion. What had choked democracy, they thought, was inflexible, uncompromising commitment to principles. What was needed was a different attitude towards our beliefs, a less ideologically confident, more tentative and critical attitude, one that would treat our beliefs as the always provisional results of inquiry to date, subject to experimental tests and revision in the light of new evidence and experience, as permanently liable to obsolescence due to altered circumstances, shifting contexts, or changes of interest. Though the point is not put this way in Menand's book, we're to see the American Civil War as playing a role in shaping the Pragmatist Enlightenment, comparable to that played by the wars of religion for the earlier European Enlightenment. Menand makes a cumulatively plausible case for how the climate of ideas in which pragmatism arose was shaped by the experience of passionate political convictions overwhelming democratic institutions and leading with seeming inevitability to the sort of senseless slaughter that Holmes experienced, and by chance survived, at Ball's Bluff, Antietam, and the Bloody Angle of Spotsylvania. But he's not very clear about just what sort of connection he envisages, Menand now, between this historical impetus and the contents of the philosophical theories the pragmatists came to hold. I think a number of issues have to be separated here. For it could be that while pragmatism would not have arisen without the influence of the war, that merely necessary condition might turn out to be of little help in understanding the thought to which it gave rise. After all, one of the crucial material conditions that made possible jazz, another distinctively American cultural phenomenon, was the flood of cheap war surplus trumpets and military band instruments left over after the same war. But knowing that won't tell you very much about what's special about jazz as music. To begin with, the view that emerges for the pragmatists immediately emerges from consideration of the failure of antebellum, more or less, democratic political practices. The lesson concerns how one holds basic action-orienting beliefs. What rules out compromise, accommodation, and reciprocal adaptation is the sort of unshakable conviction that brooks no opposition, admits no qualification, that ignores the possibility or significance of collision with other important principles, and is reckless of the practical consequences of its absolutism for the possibly worthy aims of others and the stability of the framework institutions of the community. But the pragmatists didn't stop there. They didn't just draw conclusions about the act of believing, roughly that fallibilism is a better attitude than fanaticism. Rather, the centerpiece of their philosophical theory was an account of the contents that are believed or believable, not just about the attitude of believing it. So we ought to ask, well, is there a deep connection between these, between changing your attitude about believing, about how you should treat your states of believing on the one hand, and a view such as the pragmatists came up with about the contents that are believed. To squeeze the most explanatory juice out of Menand's fascinating and instructive story, we need to know something about how an understanding of the act or attitude of believing might be thought to connect with and inform an understanding of the contents believed, the contents of those acts or attitudes. How did the pragmatists make that transition? Again, even at the low level of how beliefs should be held, the immediate lesson seems to concern political beliefs, the ones we use to orient our practical undertakings, in particular those that involve cooperation or decisions about what we shall all do. It's not obvious that considerations bearing on our assessment of admissible, desirable, or defensible features of such practical political commitments carry over to apply as well to theoretical and doxastic commitments, from claims about what we should do to claims about how things are in the natural world. How does that extension get motivated and justified for the pragmatists? If, as Menand persuasively argues, the pragmatists' ideas were in fact motivated by the spectacle of abstract, absolute political principles proving indigestible by democratic institutions and leading to the most violent sort of conflict resolution imaginable, aren't they guilty of illegitimately extending a lesson appropriate to the practical sphere of deciding what we ought to do to the theoretical sphere of deciding what beliefs are true? I mean, there's a challenge to the foundations of the pragmatist thought. In the practical sphere of morality, the European Enlightenment has taught us that we need not think of our moral principles as deriving their authority from their conformity to, their mirroring of, an antecedent, eternal, non-human, ontological, theological reality. The Enlightenment lesson was we could and should instead think of our moral principles as products of our own rational activity, as something for which we must ourselves ultimately take responsibility. As Kant puts the point in What is Enlightenment, it's by acknowledging that responsibility that humanity passes from its age of self-imposed tutelage by paternal authority into the autonomous maturity of its adulthood. A second enlightenment might then repeat that lesson, only now on the theoretical side. Doing that would be seeing norms for belief, no less than for action, as our doing and our responsibility, as not needing to reflect the authority of an alien, non-human reality, which comes to seem as mythical, dispensable, and ultimately juvenile a conception as old Nobodaddy came to seem to the erudite. Richard Rorty, my Doktorvater, inspired by Dewey and James, has been urging just such a conception of what would be required to finish the work of the First Enlightenment. He argues that the move from thinking of moral norms in terms of divine commandments to thinking of them in terms of social compacts should be followed by one from thinking of the truth of belief in terms of correspondence to reality to thinking of it in terms of agreement with our fellows. Such a conception is vulnerable to the charge that in so assimilating the theoretical to the practical, the distinction between intentions and beliefs is being elided. Intentions have a world-to-mind direction of fit. The aim is for the world to conform to our attitudes. Beliefs have a mind-to-world direction of fit. The aim is for our attitudes to conform to the world. In her classic work, Intention, Elizabeth Anscombe illustrates the difference with a parable of a man shopping from a list, followed by a detective assigned to write on his own list everything the man buys, the shopper buys. The two lists exhibit the two directions of fit. If what's bought doesn't match what's on the list, in the shopper's case, the error lies in what's bought. He didn't buy what he was supposed to buy according to the list. In the detective's case, it lies in what's written. He was supposed to write down what was actually bought. Well, think of lamp shadows and mirror reflections as having the two directions of fit. The first enlightenment can then be seen as liberating us from inappropriate use of a theoretical spectatorial model of the practical, as though our reasoning about what we ought to do, like our reasoning about how we ought to believe things are, reflects an antecedent reality whose authority settles its correctness. The old picture just used the wrong direction of fit for practical matters. But surely it would be a misunderstanding of this lesson simply to turn the old picture on its head by treating the theoretical as though it had the direction of fit and so the structure of authority and responsibility appropriate to the practical. Some people criticize the pragmatists in just those terms. But I think that that's not right. The pragmatists don't do that. They reject the dualism of a practical sphere with just one direction of fit and a theoretical sphere with just the complementary direction of fit. They start with the idea of a cyclical process of intervening and learning, of perception of an initial situation, action in it, and perception of the results, leading to a new action, including the tweaking of both means and goals, with the loop repeated until it converges or is abandoned, what I referred to earlier as a test-operate, test-exit cycle. That's what the pragmatists call experience. Talk of belief and intention makes sense for them only as the abstraction of phases or aspects from that essentially cyclical, ongoing sort of learning process that is experience. Our beliefs have practical consequences, and our intentions have theoretical preconditions. In the undertaking of actual inquiries in practical projects, one does not find one direction of fit without the other. At this level, the pragmatists are not modeling the theoretical and the practical, as the tradition had conceived those categories, but reconceptualizing both in terms of ecological adaptational processes of interaction of organism and environment of the sort epitomized by evolution and learning. In contemporary philosophical theories of perception, we're seeing a return to that sort of conception. What about the other charge? That the pragmatists slide from a view about how beliefs should be held, namely tentatively, provisionally, negotiably, to a view about what beliefs are, the view that there's something like coping strategies. That is, that they slide from an attitude, from an insight into the attitude of believing to a claim about the concepts, about the contents believed. Once again, I think, though you can see why this objection is made against the pragmatists, I think it's not appropriate. Once again, the pragmatists, in keeping, I would say, with the Hegelian roots of Peirce's and Dewey's thought, seek to reconceptualize belief and meaning so as to resist a dualism of force and content, of doing and thought, of pragmatics, the study of use of what you're doing in talking or thinking, and semantics, the study of the contents that one thereby manipulates. Their strategy may be thought of as coming in two pieces. First, believing or knowing that things are thus and so, the category of explicit, stateable theoretical attitudes characteristic of us, is to be understood in terms of skillful knowing how to do something. The category of implicit, enactable, practical capacities, characteristic of our intelligent but not rational mammalian cousins and ancestors. Their question is, the pragmatist question is, what do you have to be able to do in order to count as having conceptually contentful beliefs? And their answer will look to the role of those beliefs in practical reasoning, to their capacity to serve as reasons for action. For their second move is to offer a kind of functionalism about the propositional contents of beliefs, that is, to offer an account of meaning in terms of use. The contents of beliefs and the meanings of sentences are to be understood in terms of the roles they play in processes of intelligent reciprocal adaptation of organism and environment in which inquiry and goal pursuit are inextricably intertwined aspects. Functionalist, and more recently teleosemantic, strategies in the philosophy of mind dominate the second half of the 20th century and on into the 21st. But the pragmatists deserve to be thought of as having pioneered these approaches. And if that's not generally recognized, it's in part because the pragmatists did not achieve the sort of clarity of methodological self-consciousness that would have allowed them to separate the general strategy of functionalism about the relations between pragmatics and semantics, the relation between what's done with words and what they mean, or the role of beliefs in the behavioral economies of believers and the contents of those beliefs. They weren't sufficiently methodologically self-aware to separate that general strategy of functionalism from the more specific conceptual tactics that they employed to pursue that strategy. And here, I think, there's some real problems with their ideas at the more specific level, which have maybe made it harder to see the general outlines of their view. For when they do turn their attention to semantics, the pragmatists offer a broadly instrumentalist semantics, understanding content in terms of success conditions of intentions and actions rather than truth conditions of beliefs. Now, that's not a silly idea, but after a century of intensive subsequent work in philosophical semantics, I think we're in a position to be much clearer about the criteria of adequacy such accounts must answer to, and some of the ways they can go wrong. And from this contemporary vantage point, I claim we can see that the pragmatist instrumentalist program involves 4 distinct mistakes. First, in thinking about the functional role of beliefs in reciprocal interactions and attunements between believers and their environments, the pragmatists look only downstream to the practical consequences of beliefs. That is to say, they look only at the role of beliefs as premises in practical inferences. They don't also look upstream to the antecedents of belief, to their roles as conclusions of inferences, or as the results of other processes of belief formation. In this regard, the pragmatists simply invert the exclusive emphasis on the origin of belief in experience that's characteristic of the semantics of traditional empiricism. But each of these one-sided, einseitig is the Hegelian term, approaches to semantics leaves out the crucial complementary aspect of the functional role of beliefs. For whether one thinks of the role of belief as a node in a network of matter-of-factual causal relations or dispositions, or, as I would recommend, as a node in a network of normative inferential relations, those are the 2 flavors of functionalism, still, functionalism requires that one looks both to antecedents and to consequence, upstream as well as downstream. The meaning conferred on an expression by its role in a language game can be identified with the pair of its circumstances of appropriate application, specifying when it's properly uttered, and its appropriate consequences of application, specifying what properly follows from its utterance. Neither one by itself will do, for sentences can have the same circumstances of application and different consequences of application, or the same consequences of application and different circumstances of application. In either case, they'll have different meanings. As an example of the first kind, we could regiment the use of foresee so that the sentence, "I foresee that I will write a book about Hegel," is appropriately asserted, the belief it expresses is appropriately acquired, in just the same circumstances as the sentence, "I will write a book about Hegel." But those 2 sentences, "I foresee that I'll write a book about Hegel," "I predict that I will," and "I will write a book about Hegel," have different meanings because different things follow from them, as is clear if we think about the very different status of the 2 conditionals. If I will write a book about Hegel, then I will write a book about Hegel. And if I foresee or predict that I will write a book about Hegel, then I will write a book about Hegel. The first, stuttering inference, if I will write a book about Hegel, I will write a book about Hegel, that's as secure as well could be. The truth of the second, if I foresee that I'll write a book about Hegel, then I will write a book about Hegel, depends on how good I am at foreseeing and whether I get hit by a bus. I mean, this example was live for me during the 30 years during which I was writing the Hegel book. To see the second point, notice that one could know what follows from a claim, say that someone is responsible for an action or that an action is immoral or sinful, without for that reason counting as understanding the claims or concepts in question, grasping the meaning of the words, if one knew nothing at all about the circumstances in which it was appropriate to make those claims or apply those concepts. So in the Army, if you go AWOL, off without official leave, you're liable to be thrown into the brig. But you don't understand the concept of going AWOL if all you know is the consequence that you can be thrown in the brig. Empiricist, verificationist, reliabilist, and assertibilist semantic theories are defective because they ignore the consequences of application of expressions in favor of their circumstances of application. But in a complementary way, classical pragmatist semantic theories are defective because they make the complementary mistake of ignoring the circumstances in favor of the consequences. In fact, both are essential to meaning. The second mistake that the pragmatists make is to look only at the role of beliefs in justifying or producing actions. First thing I said, they look only downstream. Second one is they look only at practical inferences. But their role in justifying or producing further beliefs is equally important in articulating the content of beliefs. And there's no good reason to think that the latter can be reduced to or fully explained in terms of the former, that their role as premises of inference that have beliefs as conclusions can be reduced without remainder to their role as premises in practical inferences that have intentions or actions as their consequences. Trying to define the contents of internal states just in terms of their relations to outputs to the system is a broadly behaviorist strategy. And one of the things we've learned by chewing these things over in the last 40 years or so is that taking into account also the relations of internal states to each other yields a much more plausible and powerful account. That's the advantage of functionalism over behaviorism in the philosophy of mind. Though the general considerations that motivate the pragmatist approach are recognizably functionalist, when it comes to working out their ideas, the pragmatists often did so in behaviorist terms, I think because the various distinctions and considerations in the vicinity just hadn't been sorted out yet. Third, even if these two difficulties with the pragmatist instrumentalist semantics, looking only downstream and looking only at role in practical inferences, even if those two difficulties are put aside, they face a third difficulty. For in seeking to move from the success or failures of actions to the contents of beliefs, they were ignoring a necessary third component in the equation: desires, preferences, goals, or norms. Your action of closing your umbrella underwrites the attribution of a belief that it stopped raining only against the background of the assumption that you desire to stay dry. If instead you have the Gene Kelly desire to sing and dance in the rain, the significance of that action for a characterization of the content of your belief will be quite different. And the point is fully general about needing a desire or goal element. What actions beliefs rationalize or produce depends on what desires, aims, or pro-attitudes they're conjoined with. The conditions of the success of our actions depend on what we want just as much as they do on what we believe. Contemporary rational choice theory incorporates this insight. Coupling this fundamental observation with the insight that the semantic contents of beliefs and desires are also and equally up for grabs, contrary to the rational choice approach, which takes these for granted as inputs to the process, is what led Donald Davidson to his sophisticated interpretivist successor to narrowly pragmatist and behaviorist approaches to semantics. I think it's clear in retrospect that without some such structural emendation, the pragmatist strategy can't work. The fourth problem is intimately connected with the third. For although the pragmatists failed to appreciate the significance of the fact that desires can vary independently of beliefs, they did not simply ignore desires. Rather, they equated the success of actions with the satisfaction of desires, and wanted to attribute to the beliefs that conduce to satisfaction, and hence success, a special desirable property, their successor notion to the classical concept of truth. In their sense, true beliefs were those that conduce to the satisfaction of desires. But the notion of desire and its satisfaction that's required by their explanatory strategy is fatally equivocal. It runs together immediate inclination and conceptually articulated commitment in just the way Wilfrid Sellars criticizes, for beliefs rather than desires, under the rubric, the myth of the given. For on the one hand, desires are thought of as things like itches and thirst. One can tell whether desires in this sense are satisfied just by having them. If one is no longer moved to do something, to scratch, to drink, then the desire is satisfied. If, bracketing the previous point, one could infer from the success of an action in satisfying a desire, in this sense, to the truth of a belief, the pragmatist semantic strategy would be sound. The idea is to make that transition by exploiting the role of beliefs and desires in practical reasoning, in inferences leading to the formation of intentions and the performance of actions. But the desires that, along with beliefs, play a role in rationalizing actions are not like itches and thirst. They have the same sort of conceptually explicit propositional contents that beliefs do. I can't tell just by having raw feels whether my desire that the ball go through the hoop is satisfied. Never mind my desire that the engineering problem have been solved or that the chances of achieving world peace have been increased. For finding out whether desires of that sort have been satisfied just is finding out whether various claims are true, that the ball has gone into the goal, that the engineering problem has been solved, or that the chances of achieving world peace have increased. Satisfaction of the sorts of desires that are elements of reasons for actions gives us no immediate non-conceptual point of entry into the conceptual realm of contents of beliefs and of desires. The only reason to think that explanatory ground is gained by starting with the satisfaction of desires, the success of actions, in attempting to explain the truth of beliefs, that is, the only reason to pursue the instrumental strategy in semantics, is that one has conflated the two sorts of desire, the non-conceptual and the conceptual. For what is needed to make it work is something that is like an itch, in that one can tell whether it's been scratched without needing to decide what's true, and like a conceptually articulated desire, in that it combines inferentially with propositionally contentful beliefs to yield reasons for action. But nothing can do both of those jobs. The traditional early modern conception of experience is that Leibniz also wanted to have it both ways, to be simply present, given, but also to be conceptually articulated, and so able to play the role of a reason for believing something. It's just, yeah. The challenge behind calling givenness is a myth is a question Kant taught us to ask. Does the experience, or whatever, merely incline one dispositionally, or does it justify one in making a claim, providing a reason for drawing a conclusion? The pragmatists didn't give us a story about how to combine those. From our privileged vantage point, a century or more later then, we can see that the pragmatists' instrumentalist semantic strategy for explaining credenda, believables, in terms of agenda, doables, and so their theory of meaning and truth is fundamentally flawed. Of course, that's not to say that they didn't have any good ideas, or they didn't make any progress, or that we don't still have something to learn from them. I think we also know by now that the semantic strategy of the logical empiricism, that succeeded pragmatism in American academic philosophy is unworkable, and that its conceptions of meaning and truth are also wrong. The point is that forging from the insights of either a theory that fares better by contemporary standards that were achieved with great effort, in no small part by criticizing those early attempts, will require substantial selection, supplementation, and reconstrual. It's a useful exercise, I think, to divide the pragmatist's motivations and conceptual responses to those motivations into two categories: the large, orienting, strategic commitments and the more local, executive, tactical ones. My criticisms primarily address the latter. That is, I've criticized the more detailed ways in which the pragmatists try to entitle themselves to the more sweeping framework commitments. Those framing commitments, the ones I take it that they seek to entitle themselves to by doing the more detailed work, are, I think, by and large, admirable. Among the large features of thought that I take to be progressive are these. They were Darwinian evolutionary naturalists, aiming to construe the world, us, and our knowledge of the world in the terms made available by the novel explanatory structures characteristic of the best science of their time. Second, in the service of a renovated empiricism in epistemology, to go methodologically with the naturalism in ontology, they developed a concept of experience as Erfahrung rather than Erlebnis, as situated, embodied, transactional, ecological, and structured as learning, a process rather than a state or episode. Its slogan might be, "No experience without experiment." Representing cognitively and intervening practically were for them two sides of one conceptual coin. Or less imagistically, were reciprocally sense-dependent concepts concerning aspects of processes that exhibit the selectional adaptational structure common to evolution and learning, which is where they taught us to focus our attention. Third, they appreciated the explanatory priority of semantic over epistemological issues, which had been one of Kant's great lessons. So they seek to understand content in terms of experience, the process as they construe it, that is, in terms of role in learning, rejecting an orienting goal thought of as the achievement of knowledge as a static permanent state in favor of thinking of the goal as a dynamic process of adaptation. Fourth, they understand the normative character of semantic concepts, that they must underwrite assessments of correctness and incorrectness, truth and falsity, success and failure. The semantic instrumentalism I criticized is the more specific strategy the pragmatists adopted in their laudable attempt to give a naturalistic account of this normative dimension of semantic concepts. Fifth, in semantics, they tried to develop non-magical, indeed scientific theories of content, by contrast to idea theories, which are constructively responsive to skeptical worries about the success of ideas' reference to things in the world, but not about its purport. The pragmatists tried to figure out what it is we do, something continuous with what preconceptual critters can do, that adds up to thinking or knowing something, even unsuccessfully. And they were broadly functionalists in thinking about the contents of concepts that articulate intentional states, looking to the role the contentful states play in the whole synchronic developing behavioral economy of an organism in order to understand the concepts they involve. Sixth, while reasoning and the sort of intelligence that ultimately issues in scientific theories and technologies are given pride of place in their picture of us, the pragmatists moved decisively beyond the intellectualism and Platonism that had plagued the first Enlightenment by privileging practical knowing how over theoretical knowing that in their order of explanation. At this level of very general explanatory strategy, I think what one misses most in the classical American pragmatists, at any rate, what most separates them from us, is that they do not, Peirce aside, share the distinctively 20th century philosophical concern with language and with the discontinuities with nature that it establishes and enforces. The dominant philosophical lineages of the 20th century are soaked in a sense of the centrality of language. Both the Husserl Heidegger Gadamer line and the structuralist post-structuralist line that come together in Derrida on the one hand, and the Frege Russell line that goes through Carnap to Sellers, Quine, and Davidson to Wittgenstein and Dummett on the other, these are both language-centric philosophical traditions. This failure of the pragmatists to focus on what's distinctive about language and us as specifically linguistic creatures is partly because of the pragmatists' assimilationism about the conceptual. They're emphasizing continuities between concept users and organic nature. That emphasis, too, has good credentials, and I think it's fair to say that even now we've not yet sorted out the tensions between naturalistic assimilationism and normative exceptionalism about the discursive practices that are most distinctive of us. But I also take it that the philosophical way forward from the ideas of American pragmatists must be a specifically linguistic pragmatism, allied on the one hand with the later Wittgenstein and the other with the Heidegger of Division I of being and time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Brandon, for your wonderful talk. And now I just would like to share just a small presentation just in order to make some comments. And let me ask if Bruno, I'm uploading once again, so it's soon appearing for you. Okay, here we go. Great. So once again, Professor Brandon, thank you so very much. And actually, I have really like few comments and only 3 questions, because I would like to listen from our audience as well. But I have 3 questions going from the most general aspect to the most specific, because I think your talk delivers so many layers and so many aspects that will be impossible to unfold it properly here. So I'll try to grasp 3 aspects and different generality levels. So can you see my presentations, Brandon? Yeah, okay. So the first point, it's regarding the very axis of your presentation, which is that wide perspective of the American pragmatism as a second enlightenment. It could be compared to the first one in at least 2 aspects. Firstly, it could be seen, as you say, as a movement of world historical significance. For the pragmatists, like their Enlightenment predecessors, reason is the sovereign force in human life, end quote. In fact, in a letter to his brother Henry, William James claimed that pragmatism had the potential to be such a movement of world historical significance that it could be compared to the Protestant Reformation. The question here is very straightforward. The first Enlightenment, as well as its notion of rationality, have a scientific, historical, ethical, and social legacy, which, for the good or for the bad, still is object of analysis, criticism, defenses, and so on. So, for you, as the first question, What are the main points of that Second Enlightenment's legacy in its scientific, historical, but also in his ethical and social dimensions? So that's the first one. Would you prefer that I present the three, all of them?
Easier for me if I address them as we go. Will that put
It's
you
up
off
to
your
you.
stride, or shall we do that? Look, I think I gestured at some of the reconceptualizations of scientific methodology that I think we get from the pragmatists. And this is something that Peirce was particularly concerned with. But I think for looking at the historical, ethical, social, and political dimensions, consequences that, as you say, the first Enlightenment did, that's the constellation of concerns we've come to call modernity, that Hegel was the first philosophical theorist to see that there wasn't just an intellectual enlightenment, that there were social and political, economic changes that went along with this. Well, what could we say about pragmatism, where it did not have the titanic social consequences and accompaniments of the First Enlightenment. It has the prospect of that. And I think Dewey is the theorist of that. Dewey's the one who drew a straight line from the distinctive pragmatist way of combining empiricism and naturalism, what the Vienna Circle never quite managed to do. It's two wings divided over the question of what happens when your empiricism collides with your naturalism. Schlick said, well, then you should hold on to the empiricism. Neurath said you should hold on to the naturalism. And Carnap desperately tried to keep these two wings of the Vienna Circle from flying away from each other in combining their naturalism and empiricism. The pragmatist philosophers of the second generation had a view about the nature of reason that Dewey immediately draws political consequences from liberal democratic political principles, procedural principles, working in the same sort of territory that I would say Habermas does in our time, and extracting the same sort of liberal democratic political principles that Rorty also took to be consequences of American pragmatism. So Dewey devoted his life to extracting these consequences. Theoretically, I think he succeeded in drawing these connections. What the practical effect of that is, well, there's no question pragmatism was not as accompanied by the kind of practical changes that the rising tide of modernity that accompanied the First Enlightenment had. Well, not yet.
Okay. And since you mentioned Dewey, I will start the second question quoting him. In his Philosophy and Democracy, Dewey wrote that, and I quote, "Philosophy is not in any sense whatever a form of knowledge. It is instead a social hope reduced to a working program of action, a prophecy of the future," end quote. What emerges from it regarding the nature and scope of philosophy seems to be both an accurate rendition of the pragmatist approach and, Dewey himself says, a program. That seems to be a very good summary of both for Hardy, Richard Hardy too, who in his paper, A Pragmatist View of Contemporary Analytic Philosophy, seems to overcome almost every dichotomy in philosophy, realism and anti-realism, subject-object, for instance, as one of the main contributions derived from pragmatism. In support of his claim, he points to his favorite philosophers of language, namely Donald Davidson and Robert Brandom, and states that, and I quote, I'm quoting Hardy, if one adopts a non-representationalist view of thought and language, one will move away from Kant in directions of Hegel's historicism. And historicism has no use for the idea that there are recurrent philosophical problems that philosophers have employed various methods to solve. This description of the history of philosophy should, I think, be replaced by an account on which philosophers, like other intellectuals, make imaginative suggestions for a redescription of the human situation. They offer new ways of talking about our hopes and fears, our ambitions, and our prospects. Philosophical progress is thus not a matter of problems being solved, but of descriptions being improved. End quote. So, do you think that such a vision about the role and place of philosophy in our culture really follows from the pragmatist program, and therefore that's the pragmatism answer to our two cultures, like C.P. Snow mentioned, or one could say that's the pragmatist answer for our Naturwissenschaften versus Geisteswissenschaften quarrel, which is still ours.
Well, I think it's complicated. Rorty admires Dewey's overcoming of dichotomies, overcoming of dualisms. He points to one of the less attractive features of Dewey's writing, and I think of Dewey's thinking in this regard. We're sort of seeing how Dewey worked when Rorty, in a characteristic formulation, says, well, the trouble with the classic works, Experience and Nature, Logic, the Theory of Inquiry, Art and Experience, is that Dewey uses his notion of experience as an incantatory device to overcome every conceivable distinction. and I think that is the effect that Dewey has there. And that's a blurring effect. We want to overcome dualisms, but distinctions are the form of clarity, the beginning of conceptual clarity. As I use the terms, a distinction becomes a dualism when you draw the distinction in such terms that the relation between the distinguished items is no longer intelligible. And indeed, we want to overcome dualisms, but not at the cost of blurring every conceivable distinction. So I think Dewey is culpable there of using too blunt an instrument. Now, I do think that there is a historicist version of philosophy. We get it, as Rorty says, from Hegel, who understood philosophy as its time captured in thought. Well, another time, another philosophy. Don't expect the philosophy of one time, which captured its time in thought, the first Enlightenment capturing the science of its day, the pragmatists capturing the science of their day. Here we are more than 100 years later. The science has moved on. We shouldn't expect those lessons to uh, simply simply carry over. Rorty, uh, being a pragmatist after the linguistic turn, having made the move that I talked about at the end of my remarks, that having made the transition that a pragmatism that can speak to us philosophers today must be concerned with the phenomenon of language as a central phenomenon in a way that the classic pragmatists were not, with the exception of Peirce, who is in this way a way forward. Rorty has, to me, inspiring vision of the transformative capacity of the vocabularies we adopt. In particular, that adopting a new vocabulary to describe ourselves can transform what we actually are. Now, I think this is not, I think, as I say, this is an inspiring picture. It's Rorty's distinctive contribution to the Hegelian division of things into things that have natures and things that have histories, which is what underlies the Naturwissenschaften, Geisteswissenschaften divide. And this emphasis on language, and particularly in Rorty, I think does not overcome that distinction. It clarifies the distinction. We beings who live and move and have our being in the normative space of reasons articulated by the vocabularies of our times are subject to a kind of transformation that things that merely have natures, electrons and genes and so on, are not, in that what we are really in ourselves depends on how we describe ourselves, how we understand ourselves. And we can change what we really are by changing what we take ourselves to be. Not magically, we can't just make ourselves into whatever we take ourselves to be, but because it's an essential feature of what creatures like us really are, how we understand ourselves individually and collectively. Any change, any redescription, any change in that vocabulary inevitably changes in some way what we really are, maybe in unpredictable and unfortunate ways, but they do. And so one of the things that, one of the tasks of philosophy is to understand creatures like that. And in particular, to offer, as Rorty thinks strong poets do as well, new vocabularies for redescription, which amounts to new possibilities for human being. And thinking of philosophers as having that transformative task by crafting new candidate vocabularies to describe ourselves with, that's a very different task than adding bricks of knowledge to the edifice. It's not a kind of knowledge, your Dewey quote started. It's doing something else. It's a process. And I think Rorty takes Dewey's thought and usefully develops it with his view of transformative descriptive vocabularies and redescription.
So, great. So just a collateral question. So, as a consequence, for instance, Windelband's view of history of philosophy as a Problemgeschichte is also flawed.
It is, but it's not that there's nothing to this idea. That is, where Hegel and Rorty part company in this regard is that Hegel thinks that though the owl of Minerva flies only at dusk, we only understand things retrospectively. Still, the owl of Minerva does fly at dusk, and there's a distinctive kind of rationality, recollective rationality, which is rationally reconstructing the tradition we inherit so as to show it as expressively progressive, as a process whereby we've learned something. And seeing the history of problems in philosophy can be a legitimate form of recollection of expressive progress. And indeed, Rorty himself was a masterful practitioner of this form of retrospective, recollective rationality. He didn't arrange it around problems, but that was a matter of taste rather than of deep principle, I think.
Okay. Moving for the third and last, I would like to quote another letter by William James. Just one is really special, I guess, dated from February of 1886, when the then student of medicine, William James, taking part of an expedition here in Brazil, in the Amazon forest, actually, he wrote to his brother Henry James, and I quote, "I think you know what it is I most want, to have done with the work here in Brazil, to return to a life, to a self known to me. I need to have Brazil behind me, much behind. When I get home, I'm going to study philosophy all my days. I know that now. Why I could not have known it earlier quite defies my understanding. I have, I feel, squandered too much, dallied too long with what seems not essential, though it might have to do with being blind now, with living in these parts, trying to live where whatever I touch eludes me, floats off, vaporizes at a touch, the mere touch. In the next letter, I'll send you the photographic portrait taken of me, wearing a trimmer beard, the little round dark glasses, and the hat, your favorite hat, at, I dare say, a quite dramatic angle. Just for an imagetic, that's the picture. That's the portrait William James took in Brazil in a very dramatic angle. Right. So here, I think the quotation doesn't need too much further explanation, and not just because sometimes even us would like to have Brazil behind us, but because it seems to be a great example of, as you said, a situated, embodied, transactional, and structured as a learning Erfahrung. Instead of a mere Erlebnis. And such Erfahrung seems to instantiate precisely the third and fourth problems you have pointed out with pragmatist semantics concerning the relations between desires and beliefs. However, at the same time, James' account of his experience has something more that he can thematize, it seems to me. Something that defies his understanding, as he says, and something that he can only talk about through images and metaphors, being blind, things vaporizing at a touch, and so on. Well, you conclude your talk mentioning that a way for a linguistic pragmatism would be one from the division of Heidegger's, division one of Heidegger's being in time. It reminded me your analysis of Heidegger's approach to Rede, discourse, in the Tales of the Mighty Dead, where you stress the importance of thematization for Heidegger's conception of Dasein. In fact, you sum up Heidegger's view of Dasein as the entity that thematizes. Well, but, and here's my question, but is every instance of disclosedness, Erschlossenheit, thematizable in a discourse? In other words, every thematization of our experiences are understandable through the same semantic structure, like James' experience in Brazil of things, his beliefs and desires concerning his own history from that point on, or even Dasein's anxiety. I mean, or do you think we need another kind of semantics or approach to some different type of phenomena, like James' experience or Dasein's anxiety and so on?
Well, good. A deep and open-ended, richly open-ended question. I think the Council of Wisdom is let 100 vocabularies flourish, let 100 vocabularies contend. I think the notion of something that is in principle unsayable, unthematizable, that cannot be made explicit, is an incoherent notion. On the other hand, that's a limit. That's a limit notion. The idea of a discourse that makes everything explicit, that thematizes everything that needs to be for this discourse to function, I think that's a fantasy as well. We're always working at the rock face, trying to make explicit what is implicit. That is in our discursive practices. That's something like the basic philosophical calling, is to make explicit what is implicit in doing what we do, being the kind of beings that we do. And I think any particular vocabulary for doing that is going to shine bright lights on some bits of it and cast other bits of it into shadow. And that the reason that's not a tragic failure is we can always make up new vocabularies. Every strong poet, every creative philosopher, that's what they're doing. This was, I think, one of the strands of thought that takes Heidegger from being in time into his later work, is thinking about this protean capacity to produce new vocabularies to describe us in. And what I was lamenting in the last part of my paper was that this issue, the classical pragmatists are not going to help us with. They did not, anyway, James and Dewey, who were most worried, most concerned with the consequences for philosophy of mind, for social, ethical, and political consequences, did not, as Peirce had, keep language at the center of their concerns, and did not have this maybe ultimately romantic picture of the transformative capacity of adopting new vocabularies. But I think that thematizing that process is one of the great philosophical tasks of our time.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. Thank you. Bruno, I think we can open for the audience questions, either online or
Yes.
over there.
So we'll now open our question session. And first and foremost, I would like to know if Professor Thomas Hübel or Professor Mark Dexter would like to ask a question for Robert Brandom.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, Professor Brandom, thank you very much indeed for your lecture. My question is really more, if you could say something more about a particular idea that you raised about halfway through your talk. I understand the pragmatist enlightenment has very much to do with trying to overcome dualism, which you so nicely characterized towards the end as a kind of distinction where the link is broken between two things, where one can't see how the two are related with. And as one instance of those, you mentioned the two concepts of belief and intention. And you, if I understood you right, you kind of said that they are, of course, distinguished by their different direction, belief going from mind to world, intention from world to mind. And you suggested that trying to, well, make the two of them the same and obliterating this distinction between them would be wrong. And you suggested to think it would be better to think of them as somewhat, well, that's my word now, complementary. I'm wondering whether you could say something more about this, how you conceive of this, my word here now, complementarity. Because that idea seems to be very fruitful indeed. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'm thinking of the general line of thought is that the way we understand intentional states should be in terms of their distinctive role in our rational economy, in our practices of giving reasons and assessing reasons for what we do and what we say. And so, I want to look to those differences in functional role to distinguish beliefs from intentions. Here, I mentioned in passing that two approaches to these intentional states are one, a kind of causal or dispositional functionalism, and the other, a normative and inferential functionalism. And in my own thinking, I want to adopt the normative inferential way of thinking about them. So I think of beliefs as a kind of commitment, and intentions as a different kind of commitment. These are doxastic and practical commitments, respectively. An intention, I think of as a commitment to do something, describable, specifiable by the content of the intention, whereas the doxastic commitment plays a different role in reasoning. It's typically, the doxastic commitments can serve as reasons both for believing other things and for doing things. But practical reasoning has to result in the adoption of a practical commitment, an intention. So I look at the different patterns of reasoning that intentions and beliefs are engaged in order to distinguish them and take the distinctive role that intentions play in reasoning as what we make explicit using normative vocabulary. Talk about what we ought to do, what we should do, given the reasons that we've assembled. Now, someone who was a causal or dispositional functionalist is going to have to tell a completely different story than this one. But role in reasoning is what I would look for, and particularly the different role in practical reasoning that doxastic commitments and practical commitments play.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So, Professor Dexter, would you like to ask any questions?
Yeah, perhaps a very general, well-formed question. So when I recall how Peirce describes beliefs or belief in fixation of belief, it's mainly introduced as something like the opposite of doubt. And when he does it, he talks about doubt as a state in which you're uneasy, you're not calm, you're somehow agitated. You know? And belief is the opposite, it's the state where calm, stable. And this all sounds like more like a feeling, yeah? It's a state in which you're satisfied, you're easygoing, and so on. So if I think of belief like that, a very general, sentiment, yeah? A very general emotional state. Do you think that's somehow captured by your ideas about normative functionalism? Should it be captured, or how do you put yourself in relation to that?
Okay. I don't agree that Peirce is talking about belief in a feeling sort of way. I read those passages as contrasting a settled habit with a situation in which one doesn't have a habitual response to it, but is sort of unguided by one's behavioral antecedents. So, he certainly does use the imagery, use the language of being settled or of being unsettled, but officially he comes to use this notion of habit. That's what is common to the world we're knowers of and agents in. Things tend to behave in the same way, and what we want to do is understand those habits of things. Physics tells us a lot about them, and we want to get good habits for interacting with them. And what's he's talking about in terms of comfort is when we have a response. The habit is such a, oh, well, with that stimulus, this is the response I'm accustomed to giving. I am at home, zu Hause, yes, comfortable in this response, as opposed to one where I'm torn or simply have no immediate response to it. So I think it's a behavioral issue rather than a matter of feeling. I said a few words about in the compare and contrast with romanticism, and where the romantics wanted to replace the notion of the Enlightenment notion of representation with a notion of expression, but in Herder's say it's expression of feeling that they had. You can think of the American pragmatists as also having a notion of expression, but it's not feeling that's expressed, it's habits that can be made explicit in the form of principles or are expressed in our confident knowing how to go on. Those habits are what are common to knowing how just is, being able, having a good ability, a habitus, as opposed to knowing that explicitly codifies those habits. So I would say expression, yes, but not expression of feeling, expression of habit. It's a more down-to-earth practical notion. And the touchy-feely aspects, even even James and Dewey, I think that's much less important than the habit notion. They're both more touchy-feely than Peirce is, to be sure.
Can I come back on that quickly? Okay, I mean, I'm happy with saying it's dispositions, but say if you look at contemporary work on belief in dispositional terms, you think it's a multi-track disposition. And that seems to be very plausible. So you don't want just, behavioral responses, but there's a whole bunch of things which come together in one package, and they can be intellectual moves you make, but also feelings. And you don't want, I mean, I think there's, for me, still a gap that you say, well, it looks like a multi-track disposition, but one part of this is especially important is the real bit. And I would like to know more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I don't see the emotive feeling side, the sort of aura, as fundamental for them at all. That the sense in which a lot of different things have to come together in one package is that there are lots of trains of practical reasoning that my belief that water is wet could play a role in, and there might be some of them that I'm sort of much more confident about the practical reasoning in the vicinity, and others where I'm much less. But there's the belief is a node in this vast structure of practical reasoning that only some of which is activated at any particular time. But it is the nets of reasoning that matter. It's deliberation about what to believe or what to do, or assessments of somebody else's belief or doing or their reasoning. I mean, they have a naturalistic, sort of down-to-earth notion of what reasoning consists in, but so it's a sort of natural historical conception of reasoning, but that's what's at the center. And I think the emotional aura that goes with that, that's epiphenomenal for them. I mean, when Dewey talks about this, is well, things like moods can affect the way one addresses problem solving and so on. It comes very late in his story.
So, Professor Texler, do you want to further comment on that?
I think I don't agree. I mean, I mean, it's the
Okay.
that's the other view.
Yeah, great. So, anyone watching us here, the public audience, would like to comment and ask questions to Professor Brandom? So, do anyone here at StreamYard have any more comments or questions? Professor Gabriel, Professor Hübel?
Well, actually, we could like have many questions, but I mean, let us leave it open if someone else, even Professor Dexter, is once again, or Hübel. if no one has any, let me say another thing. Bob, these days I was precisely when I was writing down these few notes and few questions, I listened once again one of the last interviews that Jorge gave for a podcast made by a Stanford professor. It was very, very interesting. Then he seemed to me that he all his considerations about philosophy led him to a very pessimistic, so to speak, or even deflationary view of philosophy. I mean, it sounded to me that he became a little bit cynical, so to speak, concerning the power or the scope of philosophy, mainly in some political issues. I mean, he said, well, okay, everything that philosophy has to offer is to give better reasons for this or that kind of political behaviors. For instance, supporting democracy instead of totalitarianism or these kind of things, but nothing else. I mean, he sounded to me really like pessimistic, like tired of philosophy as even a game of a commerce of a marketing of reasons, you know. So what do you think about this kind of not Hardy himself, but I mean the once again the place of philosophy in our edifice of knowledge? I mean, since it's so criticized and so squeezed between a lot of uh, uh, commitments, but also a lot of demanding approaches from society, from ethical positions, ideologies, and so on. So, what's your current view about philosophy in our current state of affairs?
Well, I think we're only now getting a good sense of Rorty's late views. We just put out the volume of that I think it's proper to describe as his last book, which is these 10 lectures that he gave in Girona in the last decade of his life, and sort of always meant to publish, but hadn't gotten around to. And in my preface to that edition of Pragmatism as Anti-Authoritarianism was the title he gave to it. And then again in my recent Spinoza lectures on Rorty, where I'm looking at his late political arguments against representationalism in semantics, where what I think was always a political strand in his thought, thinking about relations of authority and responsibility, and seeing reasons through the lens of structures of authority and responsibility. And I don't think he was pessimistic about the political in professional philosophy in that regard. That is, I think he thought that there was a kind of argumentation rooted in the pragmatists he admired that would help us understand giving and assessing reasons in terms of structures of authority and responsibility that in the large could be called political structures. And I think he thought that could be very illuminating. I do think he became disillusioned with philosophy over the last 2 decades of his life. He became disillusioned with the way the politics of his beloved country were evolving, starting with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. Rorty had thought that philosophy was an especially valuable tradition, not to be identified with some essence or set of problems that were eternal, as we mentioned before, but rather that philosophers are people who read these folks, sort of these texts, and if you read them seriously, then you're doing philosophy. And he started off his dissertation on Aristotle. Nobody cared more about Kant than he did. Later, canonical philosophers, and he started off thinking that this distinctive tradition would have a lot to offer in our political deliberations in a democracy, in deciding what our procedures should be, in deciding what considerations we might all agree on or find a local near consensus on to go forward. And I think he became completely disillusioned with that he came to think that philosophical language was of no help in that practical democratic arena. His late book, Achieving Our Country, which is his explicitly political theoretical and political practical view, he devotes a lot of it to making wicked fun of post-structuralists who think that writing an essay about late capitalism is some kind of political activism, but who wouldn't go out and knock on doors canvassing for a political party. In particular, what I think ties together the early view and the later view is though he and his good friend Habermas agreed in their politics to a great extent, Rorty parroted his own view, saying he was a bourgeois postmodern liberal, and there's a version of that phrase that Habermas would embrace. Habermas thought that one could give a transcendental deduction of liberal democratic political arrangements as reflecting the ideal speech situation, as aiming us at the kind of undistorted structures of communication that are conducive to our self-consciousness, that if we thought hard enough about what agency is, what discursive practices are, that we could give a foundation for democratic, politically liberal arrangements, of course, in Habermas's case, purely procedurally. And Rorty thought none of that would work, and that the task that the pragmatists bequeathed to us downstream from that lesson, overarching, motivating lesson that Menand describes them as the founders as having learned from the Civil War, is that pragmatism should teach us precisely not to want a philosophical foundation for our political practices, that those practices had to stand on their own as solving problems for us as an arena of self-expression. His line of thought from contingency, irony, and solidarity is that the uses of language for public purposes in deciding what we should do are very different from the uses in our private self-formation. But he thought those public practices really had to stand on their own, that the best philosophers could do was get us over our nostalgia for foundations, for transcendentally deducing the correctness of this set of procedures. So at a certain point, having gone along together, he and Habermas went in diametrically opposed directions. Is that cynical or pessimistic on his part? He says, well, I'm just being realistic about what we can really expect of the discourse that's downstream from reading Plato and Aristotle and Kant and Hegel and so on.
Great, thanks, Bob. Bruno,
Yes.
do we have something from there?
Does anyone? Professor Damasio.
Yeah, if I could just maybe add to this sort of last point. There's a phrase that's much bandied about these days. I'd like to use it even about some of the sort of left-wing logical positivists, Carnap especially, namely that their philosophical ambition is kind of deflationist, or one talks of philosophy being deflationism. How would you relate the attitude which you just described of Rorty's to this temperament of philosophical deflationism, which of course is anti-foundationalist and all that kind of stuff, and relates in a certain way to something else you mentioned earlier, that well, what philosophers might be able to do is give us better descriptions of, well, for want of a better word, the human condition, rather than solve problems. And I mean, one could read Carnap's explicationism a little bit in that direction as well, kind of stuff. But anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing to a deep connection at any rate, that Rorty saw between sort of technical deflationism, for instance, deflationism about truth, that says, look, when you understand that to say that P is true has just the same effect as to say that P, it's a disquotational device, has some expressive advantages, but what it's not doing is picking out some superlatively important property that some things in the world have. Rorty embraced that sort of deflationism, a deflationism about intentional states. I mean, I was talking about treating intentional states in terms of commitments, rather than thinking of some internal light is going on when one believes things. Rorty was inclined to deflationism across the board about these philosophical topics. He admired Sellers picking up Carnap's metalinguistic deflationism about universals, saying, oh, well, when you say triangularity is a property, that's a covertly metalinguistic way of saying that is triangular is a one-place predicate. About as deflationary about universals as you can get. Rorty says, yes, this is what we need to do. And he saw a line between that and the view about what philosophy should be aspiring to do in the academy. He was quite concerned with Well, he would distinguish, not original to him, being a researcher from being an intellectual. Researcher, you're working in your own fach, in your own discipline or field. The intellectual is more concerned about how the high culture hangs together generally, how all these things relate to one another. And his disillusionment with philosophy, that I think is a manifestation of this connection between sort of close to the ground deflationism about specific philosophical topics and his more general disillusionment, was that he started off thinking that our fach, reading the people we read, did give us a special kind of insight as intellectuals. And he stopped believing that once he had been deflationary about enough of what we inherited from the mighty dead. He came to see philosophers as having no more sort of access to special insights than retired labor leaders, journalists, sociologists, and so on. So I think there was a connection between, for him anyway, between the ground level deflationism and his disillusion with what we could expect philosophy to help us with.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I just ask one more time if anyone in StreamYard or in the public like to ask a question. Does anyone? Do you want? Yeah. Okay. So you can come here. Yeah. It's the best way for them to hear us. So Professor André Leclerc is professor at the University of Brasilia and will make the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Is it good? No?
No, I don't think.
It's the volume is too low, I guess.
Okay, let us see if it is better.
And now,
Is it good? Or is it
Yeah, it's better.
It's better.
okay. Thank you very much, Professor Brandon, for that very interesting, stimulating conference. Maybe I will ask a naive question. Asking naive question is one of my specialties. But I've been interested by the divide you pointed out made by Hegel between things that have a history and things that are what they are by nature. And this is a theme that Jantai will discuss and go deeper in this in decades after that. Well, we and logical empiricism try to go against this view. Karl Marx especially defended the unity of science. He said that the science has one method, one language, one ontology, and but a few decades after that, Chisholm formulated a very interesting thesis. The thesis that we cannot go out the circle of intentional notion And after that, Davidson pointed out that it is not possible to reduce one vocabulary to the other, especially the intentional vocabulary to the scientific or physicist vocabulary, physicalist vocabulary. So my question would be, pragmatism and today offer a perspective, a way to close the gap between these two vocabularies we have, a way to describe ourselves as free agent with responsibilities, values, provided with one single perspective on the world, and another vocabulary we use to describe ourselves as beings with a biology based on carbon and with a specific genetic code, etc. Pragmatism offer a way to close the gap between these two vocabularies, or we must continue to work with these two kind of ways to describe ourselves.
Well, thank you. Pointing the line to Dilthey, distinction between verstehen and erklären, and Carnap's resistance to that. One of the things the Vienna Circle was always united on was the Unity of Science program. It's erklären, scientific explanation, all the way down. They saw a concern with discursive formations as falling outside the scope of that, as requiring its own method, verstehen, as an analog of vitalism in biology that said, oh, you're never going to get a natural scientific account of organisms because of the kind of unity they have, a sort of transcendental deduction of the impossibility of 20th century biology. And you trace that then through Quine to Davidson. I'm glad you didn't decide to ask a non-naive question embedded in this tradition. I agree. I think this is one of the large questions of our time, is whether and to what extent one should be an exceptionalist about the discursive and think with the hermeneutic tradition that texts and things that can talk have to be understood in a different way than things that are studied in the natural sciences, because in the end, understanding them is a matter of mapping them onto what we do. Quine begins with translational talk. Davidson has a much more sophisticated interpretivist view, but the hermeneutic idea, I think, is that, and Gadamer is fairly explicit about this with his conversational model, that in understanding a text or an utterance, one essentially depends on one's own capacity to say things that make sense, to give reasons, and speak and think consecutively. And one makes essential use of that capacity by mapping what else is going on onto one's own capacity, as opposed to just thinking about things in the way one might do in the natural sciences. So Does the logic of Sellers's space of reasons, is that a different logic in principle than the logic of the realm of laws? This is a form in which it'll come up in Davidson, in McDowell as well. Now, your overall question was, do the classical pragmatists help us with that? No, I don't think they do. I think this is a major problem for our time. It's a problem for pragmatism after the linguistic turn. And Rorty is really the one who brought pragmatism into a post-linguistic turn phase, thinking about our mastery of vocabularies. And I talked about the transformative capacity of redescription. My own view is that we should be exceptionalists about the discursive, that vocabularies work fundamentally differently than natural processes do, and seeing that if and insofar as one describes them in non-normative, pragmatic meta-vocabularies, one cuts oneself off from appreciating the facts about them that are stateable in semantic meta-vocabularies. That is, in order to underwrite the attribution of meaning, you have to describe what you're doing in talking in a richly normative vocabulary. However, starting already with Dilthey, the discursive exceptionalists drew very strong conclusions from this, that the only way to understand discursive activity is hermeneutically, is by Verstehen, is by mapping it onto one's own practice. And I think that's not true. I think it's possible for us to characterize the use of language in a richly normative pragmatic metavocabulary, to characterize the use of language in a semantic metavocabulary that starts off using inferential notions, but ends by using representational language. I think the relation of logical extensions of any vocabulary by introducing logical vocabulary into them is something we can be very precise about. And I think we can use all of those things to understand in an Erklären sort of way, in a theoretically rigorous sort of way, what's distinctive about vocabularies. But that is not going to be finding reasons in the language of the physicist. It's going to be talking about how the use of the physicist's language relates to the use of the semanticist's language. And I think, though we're in relatively early days of that enterprise, I think we actually know how to say a lot of things that help with that. But the classical American pragmatists aren't the ones doing that, by and large, because they didn't focus on language in the way that addressing that question requires. Seeing someone like the later Wittgenstein, who I take to make common cause with the American pragmatists in many ways, but obviously discursive practice is front and center for him. He is an exceptionalist and maybe more virulently anti-theoretical than the position I'm waving my hands at.
Thank you very much. So, I think that's it for today. So, first of all, I would like to thank the
Professor Gabriel Ferreira and Professor Brandom for joining us here today and accepting our invitation. Second of all, I would like to thank the presence of Professor Thomas Hubert and Professor Mark Dexter. And I would like to thank all of you who watched us at YouTube and also here presentially. So that's it for the morning session. Throughout the event, we'll just broadcast the morning sessions, so we're not broadcasting the afternoon and evening sessions. Today, in the afternoon and evening, we'll have a workshop given by Lucas Bacara, who is a member of our research group and also a PhD student at University of Vienna. And if you are in Sao Paulo, I would invite you to come here to Sao Paulo to enjoy this workshop. And if you are in another state, city, country, I'll see you tomorrow by 9 a.m. UTC-3. So thank you all.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you, Bob, once again. It was a pleasure as always. Thank you so very much.
Gabriel. Yes, indeed.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye-bye. See ya.
Die Künste und aus dem Zuschlag.